In the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, most of our commonly played strategies and archetypes aren't immediately competitive hits. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A lot of our best and coolest decks often come from the humblest of beginnings. Whether it's an archetype that explodes after getting one critical boss monster like Spiral or Gladiator Beast, or it's a long grind up the mountain as was the case for Blue Eyes White Dragon or Noble Knights, there are many paths to the competitive meta status. However, this one is incredibly improbable. A lot of archetypes have a tough time becoming competitive, but how about when an archetype largely starts out as a joke and to everyone's surprise actually makes something out of itself? This is the story of Yu-Gi-Oh's lovable punching bag Skull Servant and how it rose to become a legitimately scary meta deck. I don't think I've ever done this before, but I'm going to start this story out with an opinion. It's something I can't prove, but it's widely believed in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. I think the monster Skull Servant was created simply as a joke. It premiered in Yu-Gi-Oh's first ever core booster set, Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. While it was pretty clear Konami wanted Blue Eyes to be the most powerful monster in the set, at least in terms of raw strength, Skull Servant was on the other side of the spectrum. This guy was weak, and I'm not saying that to be mean, it was literally the weakest monster in the entire set, even punier than trash like Basic, Insect, Dark Gray, and Firegrass, all of which are, and always were, laughably weak monsters who don't even have good names for Pete's sake. Konami clearly wanted Skull Servant to stand out as the wimpiest monster in the set. In fact, they even pointed out that the card wasn't strong right in the flavor text. Terrible weak vanillas were pretty much just par for the course when it came to the first few core Yu-Gi-Oh! Booster sets. But then again, Skull Servant sat at the bottom of the totem pole. That wasn't until the fourth set, Pharaoh's Servant, was released, or Thousand Eyes Bible if you're in the OCG. This set gave us Thousand Eyes Idol, which, just like Skull Servant, was a tiny level 1 monster with no effect. However, Idol could be used to summon one of the most powerful fusion monsters of all time in Thousand Eyes Restrict. So in my book, it was actually the better card at the time. Skull Servant's only real utility was being a fusion material for the beyond mediocre Flame Ghost, a monster that took 3 cards to summon in exchange for a whopping 1000 attack and no effect. Needless to say, Flame Ghost was trash. Under normal circumstances, this would be where our story ended, a monster solely known for being weak that never did anything remotely competitive. However, for some reason, Konami took a liking to Skull Servant and spun it into an archetype named Wight. Monsters from LOB becoming archetypes wasn't new. Red Eyes, Dark Magician, Exodia, Gaia, Blue Eyes, etc., they all became full-fledged archetypes with a plethora of support. But Skull Servant had the distinction of not being played by one of the main characters from the DM anime, which was why it was fairly surprising in my opinion. Rather than dumping Skull Servant on a character like Bones, which would have actually made a lot of sense, they instead had Skull Servant appear in the GX anime and started developing the Wight archetype during this time. Konami actually started by releasing the archetype's win condition. King of the Skull Servants premiered in the Lost Millennium, the first core GX booster set. At first glance, he appeared to be a mirror image of the original, a weak, level 1 monster, but King had the ability to gain 1000 attack for each Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servants in the graveyard, so in a best case scenario, he could have a pretty massive 5000 attack. He also had an effect that would let you immediately revive him if he was destroyed by battle by banishing a Skull Servant or another copy of King from the graveyard. It was a pretty solid start, but with Lady in White, Konami really laid out how they were going to design this archetype. While King came out in the first GX booster set, Lady in White arrived in the very last one, Light of Destruction. Her on-field effect gave spell, trap, and battle immunity for all low-level zombie monsters except herself, but more importantly, she counted as Skull Servant while in the graveyard. This not only meant that King of the Skull Servants could now top out at 8000 attack, thus a one-shot OTK, but it also meant Konami was going the Harpy Lady or Cyber Dragon design route. With these archetypes, almost all the important main deck monsters count as the original monster so that they can also be used for key cards. This was an ideal design for the Wight archetype, considering their win condition was simply trying to get King as big as possible and ramming it slam into their opponent. While Lady didn't put Skull Servant anywhere near competitively viable, the design path she put Wight on meant that the deck would inherently get better just by getting more monsters and names. Konami continued to support the Wight archetype throughout the next few eras of Yu-Gi-Oh!, albeit in a very sporadic way. Wightmare came out in 5Ds, there was no Wight support during Zexal, and we got 2 cards during the Art V era. First, there was Wight Prince in Duelist Alliance, which was a huge boost to the archetype. Wight Prince could dump the original Skull Servant and Lady in the graveyard simultaneously, as well as it allowed you to summon King straight from your deck by banishing a couple of Skull Servants from the graveyard. These support cards all inch Skull Servant closer to being competitive, as now getting a huge 8,000 attack King on field was easier than ever. But the archetype still had one huge problem. The issue was getting the Wight cards in the graveyard fast enough and in mass amounts. The Wight archetype simply didn't feature any inherent ways to achieve this other than the previously mentioned Wight Prince, which only still sent 2 cards. Some duelists tried teching in cards like Needlebug's Nest and other engines such as Light Swarm, but they just weren't consistent enough. Luckily for the fans of the archetype, however, a certain card released in the second half of Art V was about to turbocharge the Wight archetype like never before. Raging Tempest was easily one of the best sets of the entire Arc V era, as it gave birth to Zodiac, the Wind Witches, and strong Infernoid support. But I'd make the argument that the single most powerful card in the entire set was That Grass Looks Greener, an all-world powerful spell card that could let you send up to 20 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard in an instant. Grass was utterly ridiculous when combined with Skull Servants for 2 main reasons. Reason number 1, it could dump numerous Wight cards to the graveyard simultaneously. Keep in mind, if Wight Prince was sent, it would actually send even more cards. Reason number 2, Grass could drop copies of the always solid Mizuki to the grave as well. Mizuki not only let you revive King for free, but usually had other solid targets like Unizombie and Shiranui Solitaire. Grass basically set up your entire deck for success with a single card.
Because King will be on about 7k? Oh! Top 10 King! Can he stop it? Can he do anything?
I'm not sure what those 3 backer are.
Forces.
Well, he does have it in his deck. We saw it in game 2.
He doesn't have any currently. Oh, it's on 8k?
And when combined with other fantastic zombie supports, actually made the Skull Servant deck fairly consistent and nowhere near as linear as it had been in the past. Add that to the fact that the Skull Servant archetype was blessed with another official Wight support card in this very same set, that being of course Wight Princess, and you had a real double whammy. Wight Princess was quite unique, as she served as almost a hand trap like card for Skull Servants. She could be sent to the graveyard during either player's turn to debuff the stats of all of your opponent's face-up monsters. This meant not only easier OTKs because your opponent's monsters would be losing attacks, but she also would just serve as another Skull Servant name in the graveyard, hence another 1000 attack for King. Grass was still largely the star of the show, however. In fact, That Grass Looks Greener was so important to this deck's success that duelists were even willing to play Left Arm Offering, which gave up your entire hand just to get access to the card ASAP. Another amazing thing about Grass is that it worked with multiple engines. While heavily zombie-focused builds of course saw competitive success, the Shadow engine was pretty popular in Skull Servants as well, as every single one of them would activate when sent to the graveyard with Grass. As much as That Grass Looks Greener gave this deck its wildly explosive plays, there was more to Skull Servants than just a single card. The Zombie and Shadow engines gave these builds some solid going first plays when you weren't lucky enough to open with Grass. Shadow Fusion and Alistair meant that builds could easily set up with powerful restrictive fusion monsters like Winda or Invoke Macabre turn 1, while the full zombie builds had access to strong 1-card Psyframe Lord Omega plays with Shiranui Solitaire that could rip a card out of your opponent's hand. Keep in mind that these plays could easily turn into double Omega with just 1 additional card like Soul Charge, Instant Fusion, or Brilliant Fusion. As unbelievable as this sounds, there were even some wild builds that saw competitive success without playing Grass at all. Those earlier builds that leaned heavily on Needlebug's Nest as their primary way of sending cards to the graveyard actually started taking off. They usually opted to run monsters that could be activated while in the graveyard during the player's leisure, cards like Electromagnetic Turtle and Pero Cerberus. I personally don't believe that these builds were as explosive as the grass versions, but you can't argue with their competitive results. During the Raging Tempest format, which lasted until May 2017, Skull Servants saw competitive success on many levels. Regional top 8s, 14th place at a Nationals event in Venezuela, and even a YCS top finish. I'm not saying that it was close to being the behemoth that Zodiac was during this time, although ironically, I did make a video in the past titled almost exactly that word for word, but Skull Servants were definitely a respectably competitive deck. I think the largest contributing factor to its demise was the limitation to That Grass Looks Greener that happened on the June 2017 ban list. Losing 2 copies of grass ensured that you would no longer be able to open with the card with any level of consistency that was necessary for a competitive deck. Grass fixed so many issues simultaneously that it plagued the Skull Servant / Wight archetype for years, it was pretty devastating to lose it. I should also mention that this same ban list axed Elder Entity Norden, thus making Instant Fusion completely unplayable in the deck as well. Sadly, Skull Servants have yet to recover from the crippling June 2017 Forbidden Unlimited list. Well, outside of dual replay videos on my channel, that is. But it does appear that Konami is keeping them on their same path. For the Frames era, it looks like Skull Servants are getting a new card. White Baking is going to be released in Blazing Vortex. This card further speeds up their strategy in a significant way, letting you add 2 Whites or Skull Servant cards from your deck to your hand, then discard any card from your hand. It's a very strong card for the archetype, but I don't think that it solely moves the needle for Skull Servants when it comes to making them see more competitive play. It does make me more confident that in the future, if Skull Servants or White gets a way of dumping a bunch of cards into the graveyard fairly easily, we could see this archetype be competitively viable again. And with that, we are at the conclusion of our Yu-Gi-Oh story. I thank you very much for watching. If you learned anything or you enjoyed the video, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos in the future.
It's going to be at 21 once it declares it.
Oh my days! That was insane. That was actually insane.
Skull Servant's too good.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the power of the Skull Servant. You
Yep.
just top deck king.